Here's one of Paul's contributions, by the way, because it's not foreign to the New Testament to say things like Jesus died because. I mean, Peter says that he bore our sins in his body on the tree, right? That sounds to me like he put my sins in his body when he went to Calvary. Well, here's one. Look at Romans 14, verse 9. I want to show you Paul had his own moment of going, hey, here's why Christ died. And then what I want to do is share with you a few of the ones that I have shared over the years. Romans 14, 9, Paul says, actually, start in 7, because you got to have a little bit of context. This is actually a new paragraph in verse 7. We do not live to ourselves, and we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again. To this end this is why Jesus died, and this is why Jesus resurrected, so that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. So Paul's version of, hey, let me tell you why Christ died, sounds like this. Christ died and resurrected so that he could be Lord over everyone who is dead and over everyone who is alive. In other words, it was Paul's way of saying Christ died so that he could understand death, and Christ died so that he could be Lord over everyone that dies, and Christ resurrected so that you would understand new life, and so that Christ could be Lord over everyone who is alive. Because where Paul goes next is, every one of us is going to stand in front of God. Every one of us is going to give account of himself before God. In other words, whether you are alive or whether you are dead, Jesus has died at Calvary so that he can be Lord over those who have died, and he is able to be Lord over those who have lived. It sounds a little bit like Paul might be saying, and I say might be saying because I didn't get to interview the Apostle Paul. That would be fun. But it sounds like he might be saying that God wanted that so that God could judge the dead, God needed to know what it was like to die. You might say, well, God knows what everything is like. Yes, but it's one thing to speak. It's another thing to do. And so when God becomes a man, I think that's also why at Calvary he goes, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Dad, I've been human. It ain't easy. We need to forgive them. This is a hard journey. And so Paul gives his own little theory. Now, I'm not saying this is Paul's only theory. I just told you he wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. We opened in Galatians 3 where Paul says, hey, who snake charmed you? The snake you ought to be looking at is the one who was cursed on a pole for you. In other words, Jesus became a curse at the cross. So Paul's cross theology is thick. I mean, it is deep. He's all over the place on cross theology. So it's okay to be all over the place on cross theology. I'm going to land you tonight with Paul because I think Paul comes up with the way to say this that sort of speaks to where I am or where I'm trying to get to in my own walk, and I think where we all are. But before I do that, a few years ago, I had a dear friend of mine who does missions work to Guatemala. He called me up and said, hey, I'm going back for he had been there 20 plus years. Every year would go in and do camps and teach. And he asked me, and I was honored, he asked me if I would write up a series of lessons for his Guatemalan outreach. He said, I want to teach on the cross. And so I prepared 7 lessons for him to go into Guatemala and teach on the cross. And he wanted really user-friendly, give me a few verses, talk about something the cross did. And I remember really having to distill sort of a lot of thought processes down into these 7 lessons. I thought I'd just kind of read them off for you, all right, and give you a biblical thought about each one. I'm not going to run you all over the Bible because 7 of them, I'll be here all night. I mean, we could preach one, but just to show you, there's a bunch of stuff happening at the cross, all right? Because I don't want you to in any way think that what I'm trying to say is that we can't find out what happened at the cross. I think we can't ever exhaust what happened at the cross. I think we can keep finding out what happened at the cross. I think where we might get ourselves into a little trouble is when we just land and we're done. And we don't keep paying attention to what Jesus did for us. The cross ought to be the source of constant wonder for the Christian, because the cross shows us everything of heaven distilled in a man, preceding the resurrection of a new man on the earth. It's God becoming us, dying as us, so that he can resurrect on the earth as the new man. I don't even know what to do with that. So I'm always in awe of it. And so I don't want you to think we can't figure out some things going on at the cross. I just don't want us to be satisfied that we've landed there. I spent too long satisfied that I'd pretty much have the cross figured out. Jesus died for my sins. Jesus was cursed so I don't have to be, list off a few things here and there. But to be evidently crucified is to see something so powerful that we don't forget. So